Okay, we will start and a very good morning, a very good evening, and a very good afternoon to everybody who's joining us from across the world and across time zones. I'm Dr. Ananya Avasthi, the founder and director for Anuvad Solutions. A very warm welcome to our speakers and to all the attendees who are joining us as I speak. So, before we jump right into the agenda for today, we thought let's just give you some context about what really is Anuvad and what is the scope of our work and why are we here. So, Anuvad, which literally means translation in the Hindi language, has been set up as an accelerator for knowledge translation, conceptualized to bridge the gap between the latest scientific evidence and policy action for promotion of India's health and nutrition agenda. Anuvad is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we also aim to provide technical assistance to the Ministry of Women and Child Development here in India, in Government of India. Our key focus areas include promotion of women-led FPOs, mobilization of women panchayat leaders for improving accountability of nutrition services, Nutri Gardens and their role in improving dietary diversity, review of the nutritional adequacy of take-home rations, and of course, an inquiry into the metrics for women's empowerment. So that brings us to the thematic scope and the thematic focus for the webinar today, which is on how do we really measure women's empowerment in the context of agriculture and nutrition. I request Apurva to please pull up the agenda for the webinar today so that we can take everybody quickly through what the program really looks like. So as you can see, after the introduction, I would like to request Dr. Sudha Narayanan from IFPRI to deliver the opening keynote. Next, we will be joined by a wonderful panel of academics and practitioners. Thanks again to Dr. Arun from World Fish, Dr. Helen from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Ms. Kuntalika from Pradhan, and Dr. Lily from the University of Edinburgh. The panel itself will be moderated by Professor Lindsay Jacks from the University of Edinburgh. And just so we all know, Professor Lindsay Jacks also serves as the academic advisor for the work that we do at Anuvad. So thank you all for joining. And this panel discussion will also be followed by giving some space to all the questions or to hopefully most of the questions that attendees may have. So feel free to put in any questions that you may have in the chat box through the duration of the webinar, and hope we can cover most of the questions that might be raised. With that, we will have closing remarks from Dr. Srivalli Krishnan from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And just to add that Dr. Srivalli has been instrumental in conceptualizing this program today, and also has been instrumental in sharing guidance with Anuvad around focusing more and more about and more on metrics for women's empowerment. So with that, over to you, Dr. Sudha from IFPRI, and thanks again and welcome to all the speakers and attendees. Please note that that there's recording in progress, and you can feel free to put in your questions in the chat box as we go along. Thank you, Dr. Sudha.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to Anwar for inviting me to speak here, which was a bit of a surprise because I don't consider myself the expert on women's empowerment or its measurement. I know I stand on the shoulders of giants, but I waded into this area because of questions I had connected with my research on agriculture and nutrition. And so that's my entry point into this. So I speak today as a practitioner who still grapples with some of the questions that need resolution. So I'm going to share a bit of my experience on both reflecting on definitions of women's empowerment, why it's important for agriculture and nutrition, but also talk a little bit of our experience with dealing with metrics and what it reveals and what it does not. I'm going to, for those of you who work on this and think carefully about it, You might wonder what's new. I mean, it's the same old story. What is it and why is it important? I know Ananya talked about the Hindi meaning of Anuvad, which means translation. There's a second meaning in Sanskrit, which means reiteration or repetition to illustrate a point. So I would like to take refuge in that interpretation of Anuvad and say that I'm going to say something that many of you already know, but this is something that's worth repetition. So I'll stop there and get started with my presentation. So I don't think any of us here uh, are unfamiliar with Naila Kabir's key work that actually talked and tried to define and conceptualize empowerment, which is the individual's capacity to make strategic choices in life in a context where this ability was previously denied to them. And in Kabir's framing, the empowerment is a kind of a multi-dimensional, multi-factor concept, which includes resources, that is access to resources, and which includes access to knowledge, agency, which is the ability to make those choices, and achievements. And in fact, in some interpretations, we often separate out achievements because when you want empowerment to lead to achievements, then achievements are not really bundled as one dimension of empowerment. Now, each of these is actually, okay, several papers have been written about each of these. And agency, in fact, is something that's attracted far more attention than others in recent years. And this agency itself is a very complex concept, and many scholars have written about autonomy, self-direction, self-determination, liberation, liberties, and self-actualization, and a whole lot of it. But today we understand a simple way to understand agency is to have intrinsic, which is power within, instrumental, the power to be able to do things, collective agency, which is power with others, and influence, which is power over others or your circumstances. So this agency itself is a many-headed concept. And the other important element of empowerment is the idea of access to resources. And resources doesn't mean objects or wealth or anything, but it's actually Kabir and others have actually talked about an opportunity structure, the choice set, and the terms on which you access resources. So these are also key elements of empowerment. Whereas Kabir sees knowledge also as something that is part of the resources. In my own work with my colleagues and several others, you would see knowledge separated out primarily because policy levers can be very different when you're just talking about addressing knowledge barriers or whether you're addressing other barriers in opportunity structures. So there is really, I mean, it's amazing how there have been very nuanced debates about what empowerment means, but there's broad agreement amongst academics on what it means. And it is the fact that it's multidimensional and they're also synergistic. So uh, some of them actually enable others. So if you have resources that may support agency, in other cases, the absence of a resource can constrain agencies, which leads to a lot of discussion and nuance about what these mean and how they are related to each other. As I said, in the operationalization of empowerment, most research actually kind of veers closer to agency than to others. And that's something I'll come back to in later in my talk. The other issue is that empowerment is valued for its own sake, which is the intrinsic value. You would want empowerment for its own sake, but it also has instrumental value. And the title of this talk is actually Why Does It Matter for Agriculture and Nutrition, which suggests that it's a tool to attain something else. The other consensus is that it's a process. In fact, Kabir's version is that you get the opportunity to make strategic life choices when it was not available previously, which suggests that it's a process. It's also multidimensional and multi-domain. So, for example, in the context of agriculture and nutrition, I think Eileen Kennedy's 80s work suggested that cash crop or commercialization of agriculture might bring in income and empower women in one dimension at the same time undermining nutrition. So this idea that there may be trade-offs is well recognized. And the fact that factors that drive empowerment in one domain might actually be different from those that work in the other domain. Now, I've said broad agreement amongst academics because I'm going to share with you some issues in our field work, which suggested that there was a very big difference between how academics and researchers define empowerment versus how women in the community themselves view empowerment. And so it's often called the etic versus emic conceptions of empowerment. And one of the things we found in extensive quality work was that the ideas of mobility, leadership, and influence dominated conceptions of empowerment, and very few women, even though they were quite disempowered within the household, rarely thought of that as being associated with empowerment. And this is not even mentioning the fact that finding local words for empowerment itself is a huge challenge, which suggests that between academic notions of empowerment versus community notions of empowerment, there's still a big gap that we need to understand before we even begin to try to operationalize the notions of empowerment. So, for example, the community members said an empowered woman means they must be able to venture out for meetings or work. They should speak up in public, solve problems, stand in front during protests or rallies, speak loudly, have courage. And very often, these were the kind of ideas of empowerment, and some of them really saw it as instrumental to bringing up children well, to taking care of the family, and not all of it is what we would consider as empowerment. It was mostly oriented to the well-being of other members of the family. And one of the things that it's an issue that we were struggling with is perhaps this intra-household issues are less salient because most of the organization of communities is around civic issues, SHGs, and the idea that women's own status is dynamic, that supposing I come in as a bride and then I eventually I become mother-in-law, my power in the household changes. And perhaps women pick their battles to minimize the risk of backlash. This is to say that operationalizing empowerment is challenging. One of this is the idea that the notions of empowerment can be very different, even if there's consensus among the academics. So implementers need to actually bridge that gap in how they communicate issues around what is empowering and what is not. The other thing is the big challenge is the measurement issue. So there are many indices today, many efforts to talk to each other about this. One view is that we need to measure such a concept. It's so complex and complicated that we shouldn't be trying to measure it at all. I'm of the view that one needs to measure something to understand the concept well, as a mirror, if you will, of the way we conceive of these concepts. And right now, there are a plethora of measures. Do we need more? Do we need fewer? Or do we just need a better understanding of what's going on? There are two others that I want to highlight in the talk today, which is the idea that when we talk about empowerment, we often also talk about gender parity. And in my own work in rural India, one of the things that comes up constantly is in the context of widespread deprivation, men are not doing particularly well either. And so perhaps we should think of gender parity as being separate from the idea of women being disempowered. Similarly, we also have this notion of uh, men versus women, but generation also matters, and mothers-in-law are not necessarily on the same footing as younger women, and so on. And the other thing that we are currently doing are deviance studies. So whenever you think of empowerment as leading to something, we think of it as being a good predictor. But there are also a lot of deviations where people are empowered, but outcomes are not attained, and they are disempowered, but the outcomes are attained. And I think these are the challenges ahead of us that I feel we have not resolved and we still need to. Now, actually, this is essentially some of the issues that I feel are pending and we need to think through more carefully. But as a way of motivating this, I'll just take you through a few of our findings. Now, why is it important for agriculture and nutrition? We know that being empowered enables you to work better, secure your nutritional status, and so on. But it can also go both ways if you think achievements are also one dimension of nutrition. The other issue, so it's not just instrumental, but just being well nourished can actually help you and perform better in agriculture or command resources in the way you would want to. The other issue is that agriculture and nutrition are distinct but interrelated domains, so that empowerment in one need not imply empowerment in another, and the factors that affect both can be very different. I want to just share some findings with you. I think many of these are commonly known that women's access to resources are very important in the context of agriculture. Traditional divisions of men's and women's tasks are blurring, even though they are still largely the same. But a lot of these is increasingly determined by structural constraints. For example, irrigation water often comes in the middle of the night, which means that women can't take on tasks that they would otherwise be willing to take on. Similarly, going to the market to purchase inputs and sale of produce is extremely challenging for women. So even when the agency and the decision making on who does what changes, sometimes resource constraints prevent these from materializing, which is to suggest that these resources could be as important as agency and the interrelationship between the two. And of course, we all know about the intra-household issues. Typically in agriculture, you have participation without agency or access to resources, but it could also vary with age. Here's just an illustration of the gendered nature of markets. On the right-hand side is a mandi where you see no women, and on the left you see women in village markets. So these are the kind of structural constraints that we somehow need to bring back into the conversation when we talk about women. I'm going to just skip forward a little bit to say that this idea of women's empowerment leading to well-being and desirable outcomes in agriculture and nutrition is needs a little bit of scrutiny because it may not happen. And I think in an effort to move this conversation forward, most of my work has been primarily in the area of nutritional empowerment, saying that if you want to talk about empowerment working in the realm of nutrition, then we need some measure or metric or conceptualization that is actually defining empowerment in the domain of nutrition. And so that was primarily what we'd done. So we have knowledge, resources, agencies, and achievements that you already know. And we picked the domains of food, health, fertility, and institutions to talk about a metric that would help us measure. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to just share some interesting issues that come up that are unexpected or surprising, which in fact then provides a rationale and justification of why we need to measure things better. And here are just some snapshots of things that are picked from various studies that I have done. One of in our mind, women do worse than men. So the question of gender parity. And here you see that the anemia rates are really high, even in irrigated areas across both men and women, with women doing a little worse than the men. And so 65% of the men have anemia even in irrigated areas across the seasons. So this is to suggest again that we need to be careful to distinguish parity from disempowerment. And we don't need to bring in the parity questions when actually the deprivation is pervasive. And Going from agriculture, so we talked about agriculture being empowered there may not necessarily translate into empowerment in the domain of nutrition. And that's one reason is because of the social norms around eating. Women eat last and least, they absorb shocks disproportionately. And in our work in Bangladesh, we found that in order to avoid domestic violence, people actually voluntarily cut back intake of food and healthcare. So I will skip these are all well-known issues. The work effort that women put in is often disproportionately large. Household duties, typically, they don't have support. In terms of wages paid, there's not, it's substantially lower than the men. And even the men, of course, get low wages relative to the expenditure of effort. And all of these continue to be issues through the work route. So your nutritional status gets undermined not just by food and health, but also by the work that you're doing. And so the type of work that you do becomes important. So So seeking healthcare, therefore, is also kind of skewed. Notice that there is a difference between women and mothers-in-law, and spouses tend to get more healthcare, and there could be several reasons. One is economic, because they are the primary wage earners, they are more likely to seek healthcare. But there are also other norms, like women can't visit the doctor alone, or they don't have support in domestic chores. Um, Now, going back to the nutritional empowerment, I won't go into the details because I'm short of time, but we essentially developed a 10 domain dimension metric that straddles knowledge, resource, agency, food, health, and fertility and institutions. We combined these into one indicator, pretty much like WEA. It was in fact inspired by WEA and designed to be a complementary index. And we found a significant positive correlation with both BMI. So this is the positive relationship that you see. We have mapped it independently for women, spouses, and mothers-in-law, which suggests that the more empowered you are, the more likely you are to have higher BMI. And the same thing also goes for hemoglobin levels. So we have a metric here that's actually a good predictor that nutritional empowerment does matter for better health outcomes. But here is the surprising thing, that we often think of mothers-in-law as being far more powerful within the household. But when we actually looked at the nutritional empowerment indices, you see that spouses are clearly doing better. So this is a distribution of the nutritional empowerment scores. So it's like a density distribution. And you have the spouses sitting to the right of the mothers-in-law and the Veni women, but the Veni women is a woman of reproductive age. But the mothers-in-law, actually the peak, the mode is actually left of the Veni women's course, which suggests that a significant proportion of the mothers-in-law are actually quite disempowered. And this goes contrary to our thinking, which actually emphasizes why we need to measure these carefully and analyze these carefully. And this goes back to the point, when you look at chronic illness, anemia, BMI, it's very clear that women and mothers-in-law are doing far worse than the spouses. But 45% mild anemia among spouses is not good news either. So when we talk about empowerment, we want to talk about women's empowerment, but equally in a society with caste and other kinds of deprivations, we need to have a more intersectional approach to understanding these deprivations. Again, emphasizing the point of heterogeneity, food knowledge, if you look at it, uh, mothers-in-law perform the worst, spouses are barely doing better. But in the health agency, you can see that their ability to seek healthcare and do it on their own. Again, you see the spouses are have very different health agency scores. And you just have to read the scores as higher, the better. That means they have more agency in this specific domain dimension. And you see mothers-in-law are doing marginally worse than women. So I guess all of this is to suggest that there are several issues with operationalizing empowerment. One is the difference between what we as academic and scholars believe and what the community itself believes. So those of you who are in the implementation field have a gap that you need to cross. The other thing is this idea that there's a lot of heterogeneity between across generations, even within gender. And it's also possible that gender parity may be there, but where in the context of widespread deprivation, one has to look more carefully about what we mean by disempowerment of women in those contexts. That's one thing. And the third thing is a lot of focus is currently on agency. And I would argue that these larger structural constraints are actually very, very important, because they may be the binding constraint. You remove the resource constraint, you might actually promote agency. And so when we actually did a decomposition exercise, we found that of Veni, a substantial proportion was contributed by resources and not really agency, which suggests that resources might be the binding constraint. I won't go into the methodology here, but this is just to give you a flavor of the sort of analysis that has shed insights into into our understanding of how we can use these metrics. So to conclude, I think reflecting on empowerment, what it means, how to measure it, and what these metrics mean is a work in progress. And I think there's been amazing effort. There's Wedge, there's Magnet, there's the CGIR gender platform. So we have a nice critical mass thinking about it, and I'm sure Anuvad will contribute significantly to pulling these together and translating it, as Ananya pointed out. But challenges do remain. How do you mainstream these concerns? Neither agriculture, nutrition, nor women's empowerment, each is needs mainstreaming, and then they need mainstreaming collectively as well. And focus on structural agency and to examine intersectionality and heterogeneity more carefully. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sudha. And we can already see that there are questions coming in on the presentation itself. So, I mean, technically over to you, Dr. Lindsay, to commence the panel discussion. We are taking down all of these questions. Maybe we can come back to the audience questions as we kickstart the panel itself. Thanks again, Dr. Sudha.
Thank you so much, Sudha. That was such a great presentation, and we'll definitely come back to some of the questions that have come up in the chat. I just want to take a minute before we kick off with some questions to our panelists by introducing the panelists. So we have four researchers and implementers who have been working in India on women's empowerment issues in the context of agriculture, aquaculture, and nutrition joining us today. So first, Dr. Arun Padari is the lead of World Fish India. His expertise is in improving aquaculture practices, farmer cooperatives, and fish value chains and markets. Dr. Helen Harris Fry is an assistant professor of nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's especially interested in the health and income costs of gender inequity and inefficient intra-household resource allocation. Our third panelist is Ms. Kuntalika Kumbhakar. Apologies for any mispronunciations. Kuntalika has more than 20 years of experience with grassroots development at Pradhan. She's working on transforming lives through women collectives with a particular emphasis on women engaged in agriculture and capability enhancement for promoting livelihoods. And finally, Dr. Lily Bliznoshka is a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh with expertise in global health and nutrition. She's currently leading the assessment of women's empowerment in the context of a large-scale randomized controlled evaluation of a government natural farming program in Andhra Pradesh. So I think we've got a couple of people who are working in Andhra on the panel today. Lily's also interested in the relationship between women's empowerment and early child development. So many thanks to our four panelists for joining us. And of course, we're delighted to have Dr. Sudha here to answer questions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with the first question. So this one I think will be more to our panelists who are involved in implementation. So the question is, it's often the case that metrics development and programmatic needs are not exactly in sync. So I wonder, when it comes to program implementation, what sort of information related to women's empowerment do you really need to actually inform programming? And kind of related to that, at what sort of frequency do you need that information? So maybe I'll just kick it over to you, Dr. Arun. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that. And Kuntalika, there you are. I couldn't see where your video was, but both of you, we're keen to hear from you. So please go ahead and chime in.
Shall I?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes,
Go
please
ahead.
do.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Lindsay. Thank you, Anuvad, for giving us this opportunity to be here with you in this very good discussion on women empowerment. As far as the fisheries sector is concerned, I'm an implementer, basically, project program implementer. So here, the information what we collect, before we start the program and even during the program, especially on the women-focused information, for example, is that availability, for example, availability and access to various resources, natural resources like availability of water tanks, lands, and any government policies on giving the public water bodies to the women. For example, village water tanks, irrigation tanks to women on priority basis. And next one is, for example, access, availability, and access to farm agro inputs like fish seed, feed, treatment chemicals. Is it available to women or not in their villages? Because for most of these are all rural activities. Then also access to finance, loan, institutional finance, what I mean, and also access to markets. It may be wholesale market or retail market, and also access to information and trainings on best practices in fish farming and fisheries technologies, and also access to government financial support, subsidies, a lot of subsidies available, how good that has been promoted in the villages by the government, agencies at the grassroots level. And also various risks involved in the business, aquaculture business, how well they are informed, women and their self-help groups, for example, and also the pre-exposure and experience of women and their self-help groups in fish farming, for example, fish farming and fisheries activities. Nevertheless, to say here, women are a dominant force in post-harvest handling and the marketing of the fish in India. They are the mainstay, if you see. But still, a lot more to do to empower them in that sector in order to complete the fish value chain. They are the important link in the value chain. So, a lot of opportunities to empower the women in fisheries sector, and we can do a lot regarding nutrition. We are looking at which blocks are most malnourished, which are most backward. Somebody saying that my voice is very low. So yeah, which blocks are very very much in need of nutrition program? What is the government priority? And what is the fish consumption pattern in those blocks? Is it a fish consuming area or not? Because we have to see the cultural sensitivities to non-vegetarian foods. So these are the things which we look into before we implement fisheries focused nutrition and fisheries programs in the villages in India. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arun. So, from an implementer's point of view, I remember that, we were saying that something is like academics have a way of looking at indicators, and for the implementers, it's the challenge of how we can simplify it for the community. And the indicators needs to be so making these indicators like from the abstraction of the sense of empowerment. So Sudhaji was saying, talking about, how this empowerment word, there is no Hindi word or, any word in the local colloquial terms. So it's a challenge. How do you explain this to the women? So we can't say and go, I want you to make you empowered. So what does it mean to them? So the indicators are supposed to be, from that abstraction to give them some concrete measurable indicators. So that's where the challenge comes, and it has to be easily recognizable so that the community relates to it. So I think in that context, we have been using VIA extensively, and we have really seen, like we were talking about empowerment, but when we started using VI, it sort of gave us a kind of a sort of a structure, and it also helped to initiate dialoguing. So for us, empowerment indicator needs to initiate dialogue with the community, and the community then together will devise strategies of empowerment. It's not us. You see, we come from a different level of mental map, and their mental map is of a different kind. So if we go and make the strategy for them, there is a lot of scope of making mistakes there. But if we really map it out there with them, and the indicator should be like that. So if we use those indicators which can help that dialoguing, that makes a lot of sense in developing those kind of dialoguing, and the women can then have measure them according to their own things. For example, leisure, they never thought of it as an empowerment indicator, which we have in VI. So when the women started looking at it, they said, okay, next 3 months, let's do this. We will every week. So self-help groups meet every week. So that we will have to have take rest. Let us see how many of us are making time for some leisure. So those kind of small steps, which sort of uh, kind of pushes each other as a collective to achieve some of those empowerment. So I think that it is very important to have those indicators, which is in tune and simple, and which the community identifies with. So it can be contextual also. That's all I have to say here. Thanks.
So much. That really, it's nice to hear you say that, because it really brings in what Dr. Sudha mentioned as well about just trying to match the community notions of what women's empowerment is with what researchers are collecting data on. So thanks so much for that. So I'm going to move on to a question that perhaps Helen and Lily, you might be interested in replying to. So the question is, questions on metrics like the WEA, which was just mentioned, as well as the WENI, which Dr. Sudha mentioned, are really different than the types of questions that we usually ask in agriculture surveys or nutrition surveys. For example, how much input does a woman have in making decisions about cash crops that are grown? We spent hours trying to translate the word input in Andhra Pradesh into Telugu. So they're a bit different than just asking, what did you feed your kid yesterday, which is a bit more straightforward to kind of train field staff on. So I wonder if you have any thoughts in your experience with using these tools as part of research studies. What sort of additional prep work is needed to really get field teams ready to use these tools, as compared to usual routine nutrition surveys? So Helen and Lily, not sure if either of you have thoughts on that, but feel free to just chime in and unmute yourself.
Lily, would you like to? I'm happy to take a start.
Yeah, go ahead, and I'll go after you.
Okay. Thank you for your question. It resonates with exactly what I was going to say, that when I started using WEA, one of the Empowerment in Agriculture Index tools, I just completely underestimated how difficult translation could be and how context-specific meanings can be. And I think in terms of practical solutions, I think the best thing and the best way to deal with that is to give yourself enough time to test out each question, ask respondents then, like, how do you interpret these questions, and discuss with them during piloting phases, is there a better way to phrase something, and give that plenty of time, because it's crucial. One of the issues, as an example, that I came across during field testing in Odisha was that concepts were often conflated or maybe simplified. And perhaps correctly so. So, for example, women found it really strange to be asked about their control over a household's decisions on income generating work, and then to be asked again about their control over the income from that work. And it's actually very difficult to know how much of that confusion is simply, a translation or a training issue, and to what extent that conflation is actually stemming from genuine, real overlap that exist in these domains of empowerment. And I think that's where the prep work and contextualization is really critical. I think one other issue that we've come across quite particularly so, I would say, in Odisha as compared to in other places in South Asia where I've worked, was that a lot of women wanted to say, I make decisions jointly, or I share this asset jointly. And our qualitative work in Odisha showed that there's a very strong normative ideal that decisions should be made jointly, and that households should cooperate and care for one another. And so it's quite difficult to know whether, when they say that they make decisions jointly, whether that actually means that these women do have meaningful control over these decisions or assets. Or do they just say it because they think that's the right thing to say? So in this context, I've wondered whether actually the women saying I make all the decisions by myself is maybe a more accurate indicator of real control, or at least perhaps it's giving you fewer false positives in women's, because of those women saying, you know, what they feel they should say. But at the end of the day, I think these are crude tools that are trying to capture a very complex reality and a complex construct. So as with any research, it's about trying it out, testing it, listening to people and hearing whether your tools are doing the best job that they can do.
Thanks, Helen. That's really, really valuable. Lily, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Helen already touched upon like quite a few challenges that we're currently facing with our research in India as well around translation and really disentangling these differences in definitions, that it's unclear if people are just confused because of the translation, or there may be some like inherent issues around empowerment that we're not able to capture. But I generally think that there's a lot, in terms of using women's empowerment metrics, there's a lot we can learn from how people in psychology particularly validate and use different types of tools in different types of contexts. So one example is that we often translate, it's researchers in different contexts that translate these tools, you know, using women's empowerment tools, using kind of complicated language that's difficult to describe to people. So we do need to kind of conduct a lot more formative and piloting work. So with child development tools, for example, that happens with, you know, a group of experts first discussing what this means in this context, right? Like, what is control over assets? What is input into decision making? What is a cash crop? What is a, you know, a food crop? What is that in the specific context? And then going through this process over and over again with different participants and piloting it until it's very clear what each item on a questionnaire means. And it's easy, like that contributes to the training of the enumerators, kind of strengthening the team, but really making sure that what we're asking is capturing what we want to capture in a way that's also not compromising these women's empowerment tools that have been developed and tried in different contexts, like the WENI and the Way Up, for example, that we've been talking about today. But I think generally, like, we do need to engage more with the communities we're trying to measure empowerment with at an early stage of the research, especially when women's empowerment is a key outcome, a key mechanism, and kind of an important aspect of the research and the programming.
Kuntalika, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, a small point here is, you know, this indicators, it was like when we were also transacting, it was a challenge for us. And across India, you know how diverse it is. So our organization is working in Odisha, in Jharkhand, and in Chhattisgarh, and the languages are very different. The colloquial terms are so different. So it was really, I can really, Helen was talking about the struggle she's facing. I can really connect to that. But at the same time, what we found very easily, this is an experience that if the women have been been exposed with some gender consciousness training, some kind of programs around gender, they were able to relate and connect to the questions differently. So that's one point here I would like to highlight, that when we talk about empowerment, devoid of really bringing in the gender consciousness into the perspective of the women, they will never relate to the question the way we want to use that tool. So sometimes it's really interesting to see, you know, I would like really test it out where we have not done, when we have seen that, where the training has not been done, their connection to the question was at a lower level than where it has been done. I thought I'll just add it to that point that Helen and Lily were sharing. Thanks.
That's a really, really interesting observation, and does maybe suggest the need for more gender-specific programming integrated into these nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs. Yeah. So we related to this point as well, we've got a question in the chat, which I think is definitely one worth addressing for the audience of the webinar today. So the question in the chat relates to a women's economic empowerment program that's running in 4 locations across India with about 4,000 women. And they've realized that the perceived empowerment dimensions are different in rural and urban settings. and across generations. And one of their major goals is measuring women's empowerment, but they're a bit unsure about how best to measure women's empowerment when it does need to be tailored for a local context. But that means that the questions are different within a given sample. So is there a way that you can have that contextualization of the survey, but also be standardized enough to allow for direct comparisons across the different sites? So any experience with this, either in preparing for the study or in terms of maybe even post hoc secondary analyses of women's empowerment data that have been collected from different studies using different instruments and trying to, compare them across studies? Please chime in, anyone. Feel free to just unmute yourself or raise your hand and share some thoughts on this. Lily, I know you've done some work with DHS, which measures women's empowerment. I wonder if you could maybe just speak a little bit about how DHS has approached this, if you think that would be relevant to the conversation.
In terms of data, DHS, the demographic and health surveys, they're easy because they collect the same questions in different countries. Where the complexity comes is what questions and indicators researchers choose to represent empowerment and construct metrics of empowerment using DHS data, which then makes it difficult to interpret findings. So I think, yeah, DHS, I think definitely kind of easier when you have different locations. Relatedly, some work we're doing with primary data on women's empowerment and crop diversity. We have data from 4 different locations as well, which collected different versions of the WEA, so the AWEA and the ProWEA. And that has come with quite a few challenges in terms of harmonizing the 2 metrics and kind of developing a similar enough exposure so that we can compare it across different settings. And some of the issues come from this adaptation process of the metrics that is obviously, as we've been talking, very necessary. And we need to be asking questions that people understand in light of the research objectives, of the program objectives, and in light of the, how long the rest of the survey is, because that's obviously a really big consideration when we go visit households and take up their time for like 2-4 hours a day. And so really, there aren't, I would say there aren't really good established processes or guidelines. That's probably something we as a research community should think about developing, but kind of having the raw data at like the very basic questions that we ask and starting from there and kind of going up the aggregation process of creating different indicators of women's empowerment is one way to approach this issue. And as well, kind of thinking about the different domains and what the metrics capture. And for our purposes, of course, because we did have the WEA, the WEA resources online and the WEA community of researchers have been incredibly helpful. So kind of having that community that we're also establishing through this webinar of practitioners and researchers interested in women's empowerment is incredibly helpful in thinking through these really complicated issues. Over to you, I guess, Helen.
Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Of course. I was reflecting on this question, and I suppose there's a necessary trade-off between contextual relevance and cross-contextual comparison. And we need to, I think, just be comfortable with that, because I don't think there's any getting around it. And personally, for me, I think what's more important is to have contextual relevance and perhaps just treat different contexts differently and not necessarily aggregate. But that's perhaps controversial. People feel free to disagree with that. It's just a reflection.
Thanks, Helen. And I think it also just gets to what objectives the project has, of course. It may very well be contextually relevant measures over time would really give you the richest information in a given group rather than comparing one group to another. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this issue? Kuntalika, I know that you've done work in many different places because you kind of mentioned the issues around translation. Have you tried to do comparisons and standardization or a general approach to go for contextually appropriate measures?
What we have done is try to understand the tool and as much as possible bring it into the context of the women. So that's where we tested it with a small group of women. So we don't likely start ourselves. We tested with a small group of women and try to see what they are really reading in it and then sort of tweaking it accordingly. That's one aspect of it, and another is that we take it as one and we'll try to see the layers of it. So the way that Sudha has done, so mother-in-laws, the kind of responses coming from them and the daughter-in-law in the same question, and even the daughter, daughter-in-law, mother, daughter, and if there are any cuts into that, and men obviously are there then. So that's where we try to connect and relate, because we look at more from a strategy development for program implementation. So we try to understand what are the gaps and where they are vis-a-vis those indicators and what's happening. So a lot of process indicators help to measure those issues, just the gap where they are or what kind of strategy we can fit in. Not very conclusively, but that's how I do the assessment from the indicators to make strategies for the program.
Great. Thanks so much. So I want to revisit this idea of more gender-specific programming in agriculture, aquaculture, and nutrition-sensitive agriculture type programs. So, Dr. Arun, I might ask you a little bit more. We learned a little bit about what you measure before you start implementing programs, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any sort of gender-specific programming that you do as part of World Fish programs.
Yes, of course. In India, for example, we are focused in promoting, fish farming by women self-help groups in village tanks and also in irrigation tanks. So this requires kind of, convergence among different departments. Otherwise, here the norm is, normally the departments like fishery department, they are working in silos. Their focus is only on production of fish. How much more fish you produce? That's it, and nothing focused on women empowerment and nutrition. Though fisheries sector can contribute greatly for nutritional gains, women empowerment, job creation among youth. All these things are there. But in government at higher levels, in the department, if I see, that sort of focus is not there because it is traditional. It is seen as welfare sector. It is not a kind of other sectors, development sector. Government has to spend on fishermen for their welfare only by giving the subsidies, not nothing else. So there is a change after intervention. For example, in Odisha, after we came in 2016 with Government of Odisha Department of Fisheries, she said there is a 5 times increase, fivefold increase in the government budget on fisheries programs through policy. And one of the flagship program is, as I told you, that is fish farming by women self-help groups in Gram Panchayat tank. So far, in last 4 years, we have covered more than 10,000 women self-help groups, more than 100,000 women households entered into this program. Another 50,000 tanks are there. So much of impacts because fisheries can get a lot of income gains for the women members in the self-help groups. And the fish is a very important part of diet in Odisha. It is sold like hotcake. It is a deficit state. It's a fish deficit state, and we are importing a lot of fish from neighboring Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so there is lot of opportunity to easily produce and market the fish in Odisha. Only thing is that we need to channelize the idea, give the trainings to the women members to farm fish, and give them opportunities through various means, including policy measures. We brought in a change in policy for long-term leasing of village tanks to women SHG. This is a big step forward. And today, this kind of policy changes is thought by other state governments like Telangana government, government of Assam. So, and also in Jharkhand, they are changing they are planning to change it, and also in Bihar. So these are the success stories. And we are also, we have implemented another program called, fish-based nutrition in Anganwadi centers. So we have taken fish, dried fish powder. We have included that in hot cooked meals in Anganwadi centers for kids of 3 to 6 years age group, and also in take-home rations for pregnant and lactating women. We have given, dried small fishes. These are all prepared by women self-help groups in the coastal villages using the hygienic solar dryers. So this kind of promotion we did in Odisha, and it is very successful.
Thank you so much. So I have lots more questions, but I'm afraid we're at time for our panelists. So please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that we didn't reach, and we'll respond to you via email. But for now, I think we'll thank the panelists so much for their time and contributions today. And then I will pass it over to Shivali for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thank you for the excellent group of panelists today, and also practitioners who have applied some of these measurement tools. So I just wanted to take a step back, as you know, when we talk about from the development practitioners, but also from the donor community, why do we want to think about measuring women's empowerment in agriculture and nutrition programs? So if we just unpack the word empowerment, and I know Sudha was also trying to unpack the word with different semantics, but I just wanted to share that often in the past, a lot of the programs, whether it is agriculture or nutrition, while they have had positive impact, often also have unintended consequences. So in the long term, specifically, several large donor communities also, when they were kind of looking at the unintended consequences, often they would impact women differently than men. And that was where I would say, initially USAID and number of DAC community actually came up together to create this Women's Empowerment Index to be able to measure that effectively. And at this point of time, I also wanted to highlight that what is the role of the research community, but also practitioners who are here, is that it is important that when we really look at program design, at that point itself, several things have to be taken into consideration. So often we think about a program design, saying that this is a pilot, but few things that have to be taken into consideration is the scale. So whenever we are thinking of scale, and we need to think of it at the start of the program design, it is also important that what scale would cause, whether it is the intended consequences of the program or the unintended consequences. And for that very reason, it is important to, one, establish a baseline, but also employ these tools that we have today to measure the empowerment index in the context of these program design. Secondly, we had a lot of the discussions around different types of this VI indexes, their modifications. We also have now got a good understanding of what we call as ProVEA, which is basically a project level women's empowerment in agriculture index. And we feel that at the project level, this has certain modifications that we try to establish, but also make it less onerous. I think several of you said, like, when we go into the community, we are looking at 2 hours time that a woman in the household has to understand the questionnaire and being able to answer some of these complex questions on decision making, on agency, and so forth. Why should that woman spend this much time for sitting in front of us and being able to answer some of these complex questions? We are not going to reimburse any cost of the time or anything in that forward, but it is a research program for ourselves. I think it is important that we take that very seriously, the time they're investing to answer some of our research questions, because we are there to use that research findings to improve the program design, specifically making sure that the negative impact of a program design is minimized to an extent. And that is where I feel that it is important that we take this tool very true to the design, but at the same time, I think often we do research for the sake of research. But I think as a development practitioner, I would say let's do the research for the intended purpose at this point of time. How are we informing policymakers? How are we informing the community leaders? And how are we informing the program design specifically on the programs that we are doing? So, for example, Arun may have got great insights into programs that worked in Odisha. Can we take some of that findings to the work that we are doing in other states in India or other countries in the world who have similar context? Similarly, we may have a empowerment in nutrition index for a similar design programs elsewhere. And I think this is where platforms such as what Anuvad is creating, which is translating, research to, something that is basically evidence for what works and what doesn't. I think it is important to bring in more of a community of practice to be able to share with the community that is involved in this work more proactively and more frequently, because we don't want lessons learned that said that there was a negative consequence because a particular intervention being repeated elsewhere and again cause the same cycle of events, versus if there is some success factors, how can we quickly adopt it rather than reinventing the wheel? So thank you again, and thank you to the Anuvad team for this platform. But I also wanted to really putting it again that this is a great platform, but also for both the research community and the development community to come together and think of these sort of issues in a much more proactive way, and how we can inform some of these in future program design. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Shrivali. That was very useful. I think takeaway for Anuvad itself, and I see that a lot of work is has been shared on the chat box. So please be assured that I think this is one of the major intentions of Anuvad, which is to allow for cross sharing of knowledge. So in case there is any work that you would like us to share further within our networks, if there are any partnerships that you would like to explore, or if there is any synthesis of evidence that you might have already done that could be of help and use to practitioners, academics, and at some point policymakers, feel free to join our learning network and share these resources with us. I would again like to thank all our speakers and all our panelists for joining us today. I would just end by saying that there is usually a lot of talk about women's empowerment, especially in India. It's such a catchphrase, but very few go behind answering what does it really boil down to. And with the country as diverse as India, definitely unbundling what women's empowerment really means in different contexts and especially if it's based on the responses from women themselves, and their own knowledge and resources in terms of being able to answer such questions. And then I think that's all been very helpful. This video recording will be shared with all the attendees, and of course with all the panelists and speakers. And I would just like to end by adding a special thanks to Apurva Kalra, Hema, and Amey from our team, who've been instrumental again in putting all of this together. Thank you so much, and have a good day and a good evening ahead. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks and bye-bye.